There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone can always reach. Not the exhaustion of hard work, but something quieter and more corrosive. The fatigue of being endlessly available while somehow never being truly valued. This person answers every message. They show up whenever asked. They rearrange their own plans to accommodate other people's needs without being asked twice. And yet somehow they are treated with less consideration than people who give far less of themselves. Carl Jung spent much of his career studying exactly why this happens, and the answer he arrived at unsettles almost everyone who hears it. Being endlessly accessible does not earn respect. In the deepest layers of human psychology, it does the opposite. To understand why, Jung would first ask you to separate two things that most people confuse: being liked and being respected. These feel similar on the surface, but they operate through completely different psychological mechanisms. Liking someone is often a response to comfort, to ease, to the absence of friction. Respecting someone is a response to encountering something solid, something with its own shape and its own limits, something that cannot simply be absorbed or reshaped to fit whatever is convenient in the moment. A person who is always accessible optimizes entirely for the first category. They become easy, comfortable, frictionless. And in doing so, they often accidentally remove the very quality that would have earned them the second. Jung's framework helps explain why this happens at a level beneath conscious awareness. He described the persona as the mask a person presents to the world, the socially agreeable version of themselves built to secure approval and belonging. For many people, especially those raised to believe that their worth depended on being helpful, easy, and undemanding, the persona solidifies around endless availability. It becomes not just a strategy, but an identity. The problem is that a persona built entirely around accommodation communicates something specific to everyone who encounters it, whether or not they could ever put it into words. It communicates that there is no cost to taking. There is no risk of pushback, no boundary to bump against, no version of this person that says no. And the unconscious mind, in nearly everyone, reads that absence of resistance as an absence of value. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths buried in Jung's understanding of human relationships. He believed that people do not primarily calculate worth through generosity received. They calculate it through scarcity encountered. A limit, a boundary, a moment of friction signals that whatever lies behind it must be protected because it matters. When a person offers themselves without any friction at all, endlessly agreeable, endlessly on call, the psyche of the person receiving that access does not interpret it as evidence of extraordinary value. It interprets it as evidence of low cost. This is not a moral failing on the part of the people around the accessible person. It is simply how perception works when there is nothing to measure resistance against. Jung would push this further, into territory that explains why the pattern feels so personally painful rather than simply inconvenient. Many people who fall into this role were not born believing that accessibility equals worth. They learned it, usually early, usually through a specific kind of conditioning. Perhaps affection in their early environment was inconsistent unless they were useful. Perhaps conflict felt so dangerous that they built an entire personality around avoiding it by saying yes before anyone had to ask twice. Jung considered these early adaptations survival strategies, not character flaws. But a survival strategy formed in one context does not simply expire when the context changes. It becomes an unconscious pattern that continues operating decades later, in relationships and situations where it no longer serves any protective function at all. The adult keeps performing the accommodation that once kept a child safe, without realizing the danger that shaped it is long gone. What makes this especially difficult to see from the inside is that the behavior does not feel like weakness while it is happening. It feels like virtue. Saying yes feels generous. Being reachable at any hour feels caring. Absorbing other people's demands without complaint feels like some form of quiet strength. Jung would not deny that these qualities can be genuine expressions of care, but he would insist on a harder question underneath them. Is this generosity flowing from a full, secure sense of self? Or is it flowing from a fear of what might happen if the person stopped being useful? The two can look identical from the outside and feel completely different from the inside, and only the person living it usually knows, if they are honest enough to look, which one is actually driving their behavior. There is a specific psychological cost to this pattern that Jung took seriously, one that goes beyond simple unfairness. He believed that a person who cannot say no eventually loses the ability to locate their own preferences at all. When every decision is made in reference to what will keep the peace, what will avoid disappointing someone, what will maintain accessibility, the individual's own internal compass gets used less and less until it grows faint. This is not dramatic in the moment. It happens through accumulation, one small accommodation at a time, until a person can find themselves decades into a life built almost entirely around other people's convenience, with only a vague and uncomfortable sense that something essential about themselves went missing somewhere along the way. Jung's concept of individuation offers the sharpest lens for understanding what is actually lost here. He believed the central task of a life is to become a distinct, whole individual, rather than a collection of adaptations designed to please the people around you. A boundary, in this framework, is not selfishness. It is one of the basic structural elements of a self. Without boundaries, there is no shape to the personality, nothing that marks where one person ends and another begins. An endlessly accessible person, however kind their intentions, is in a very real psychological sense unfinished. They have built an elaborate exterior of usefulness around an interior that has not yet been allowed to fully form, because forming it would require the very friction they have spent years avoiding. This helps explain a pattern that confuses and hurts people who live this way for a long time. The people they give the most to are often the ones who respect them the least. Jung would say this is not a coincidence and not a matter of surrounding yourself with the wrong people, although that plays a role. It is a structural consequence of the dynamic itself. When one person consistently absorbs the emotional or practical cost of a relationship without ever asserting a limit, the other person is never forced to develop consideration, because consideration is only required where resistance exists. Respect in this sense is not a gift one person can simply decide to give another. It has to be built through repeated encounters with a boundary, a preference, a no that is taken seriously. Remove all of those encounters, and you remove the only mechanism through which respect could have formed in the first place. None of this means the answer is to become cold, withholding, or performatively difficult. Jung was suspicious of any solution that simply swapped one persona for its opposite, replacing the mask of endless accommodation with a mask of hardened detachment. That would still be a mask, still a performance rather than an authentic self. What he pointed toward instead was something more demanding, the slow, often uncomfortable process of discovering what you actually want, what you can actually tolerate, and where your genuine limits lie, and then allowing those things to show up in your behavior, even when it creates friction. This is not about testing people or manufacturing boundaries as a strategy to win respect. It is about finally letting the parts of yourself that have been suppressed for the sake of accessibility become visible. Because a self that is fully visible is the only kind of self that can ever actually be respected, as opposed to merely used. Jung would also point out something quietly hopeful, buried inside this difficult truth. The friction that a person fears will drive others away is very often the exact thing that finally earns the regard they had been trying to secure through endless availability. People who previously took someone's constant yes for granted are frequently, and sometimes immediately, recalibrated the first time they encounter a genuine no. Some relationships do not survive that recalibration, and Jung would say, this reveals something important. Those relationships were never built on respect for the whole person to begin with, only on convenient access to the accommodating part of them. But other relationships deepen considerably once a real boundary appears, because for the first time, the other person is relating to an actual individual rather than an infinitely flexible resource. The deepest implication of Jung's thinking here is that accessibility and worth were never actually connected in the first place. no matter how thoroughly a person may have been conditioned to believe otherwise. Being reachable at every hour, saying yes before being asked twice, absorbing whatever is placed on you without resistance. None of this creates value in the eyes of another person's unconscious mind. It creates convenience, and convenience is quietly, almost invisibly, the opposite of what earns real regard. What earns regard is the presence of an actual self, with edges, with limits, with a no that means something precisely, because it is not handed out freely. Jung would say the work is not to become less generous. It is to stop confusing generosity with the erasure of your own boundaries, and to finally let people encounter the whole of who you are, including the parts that used to disappear the moment someone needed something from you.